One tree is an icon of the British countryside. It is, of course, the oak. Today we begin an extraordinary experiment. We want to understand this species as never before, and to do that, we will film this one remarkable specimen for an entire year. Armed with the latest technology, we will investigate how our oak battles to survive through 4 very different seasons. In autumn, we go underground to see how its roots stocks up on precious resources.
What we are looking at is a highly dynamic system.
In winter, we discover the sophisticated strategies our tree uses to take on everything the elements can throw at it. In spring, we find out how it senses the world and how it even has its own form of language.
It talks to itself. There's a chattering goes on across the whole canopy.
And in summer, we'll see it fight predators hell-bent on eating it alive. Over the next 12 months, I want to see the world as our tree does and tell its amazing story.
Wow!
In the coming year, I can't predict exactly how well it'll fare, badly or well, but I can promise you one thing: you will never look at an oak tree in the same way again. The oak we've chosen to follow for our year-long experiment stands in Wytham Woods, just outside Oxford. It's a rather special tree. For a start, it's almost 400 years old. That means it was a sapling during the battles of the English Civil War. It was laying down its roots as Isaac Newton described gravity. And it matured as Britain underwent its Industrial Revolution. What's more, our oak is in a rather special place. In 1942, the University of Oxford acquired Wytham Woods, our oak's home, specifically so scientists could research British woodland. And I know these woods extremely well. I taught biology at Oxford for 20 years, and my students and I used to come and study the countless insects that live here. The climate, bird populations, the soil. Scientists know a lot about Wytham, and this will help us better understand our tree and how it changes as we follow it through the year. Our year-long experiment begins in late August, and the first task is to assess our tree's condition. To do this, forestry scientist Dr. Matt Disney and Dr. Eric Casella will create an incredibly accurate 3-dimensional map of our tree. This is done by firing almost 2 billion pulses of laser light at our oak. The end result is this beautiful image, a virtual oak. A year from now, it will help us find out how our oak has fared, how much it's grown, and how much new wood it's made, even how much oxygen it's released. We get some information straight away. Our tree is some 90 meters tall and 30 meters wide. But for me, there's another quite astonishing and quite unexpected detail.
One of the really interesting things that we can get from these data is we can estimate the total number of leaves on the tree, and then from that...
Without counting them?
Without counting them manually. And I'll tell you, I have manually counted leaves on an oak tree just recently, and it's not a fun job. And being able to do it in an automatic way without getting your hands dirty like this is far preferable.
How many?
Well, we think that there are around 700,000 leaves on this tree.
To me, the fact that you can tell how many leaves this tree's got is just incredible. How many?
It's amazing, isn't it? The total area of those leaves is about 700 metres squared. So to put that in a bit of context, that's about 3 tennis courts worth of leaf area.
Our oak needs all these leaves because they capture sunlight, the source of all its energy. But now, in late August, our tree is acutely aware that sunlight will soon become a precious commodity. As autumn approaches, the days shorten and the temperature begins to drop. To survive, our oak must transform itself. Well, it may look as if not much is happening, but all across our tree, a dramatic process is taking place. Our oak is beginning a colossal redistribution of its resources. Well, it's been through this process hundreds of times before, but each time is no less challenging. To see what our oak is really up to, we need to picture what's going on beneath its bark. As autumn begins, throughout all the branches and leaves, a hubbub of chemical messages are now being sent and received. These chemicals are known as hormones, and our tree is producing them to prepare itself for the autumn. Well, it may seem odd, but just like us, trees have hormones. These chemical messengers flow through the body of the tree, controlling and managing all sorts of important processes. In us, these hormones are responsible for some of the biggest changes we'll go through in life, like pregnancy and puberty. In our tree, they're responsible for an equally crucial change. As autumn gets underway, driven by hormonal signals, trees begin to break down pigments and nutrients in their leaves to store over the winter. They begin to eat themselves. The result is a spectacular change in the colour of the leaves. Once the nutrients have been extracted, trees like our oak will then start to shed their leaves to conserve water and energy in the coming months. But how exactly does our tree know when it's time to begin this huge change? For a very long time, people assumed changes in autumn were triggered simply by a drop in temperature. But what happens if there's an unusually cold spell in summer? How does our tree know not to drop all its leaves? It turns out that trees rely on a far more sophisticated method than temperature alone to sense the changing seasons. In their own way, they can see what's going on. Well, this should give you an idea of how most plants see the world. While you and I can perceive a wide range of colours, trees like our oak are only able to sense the red light in the spectrum. And they can do this thanks to an incredible chemical pigment in their leaves called phytochrome. Phytochrome, a substance in our oak's leaf cells, is incredibly sensitive to the red light that makes up part of the sun's rays. It's a kind of chemical stopwatch that is also able to measure the hours of sunlight and darkness. So as the nights get longer, the phytochrome acts like a signal telling the tree that autumn has begun. This means that all the hormones that prepare the tree for the cold months kick in at exactly the right time. It's now October, and our tree is not only dropping leaves, it's also time for our oak to release its most precious cargo. Autumn is not just a time for preparing for the cold, it's also when our oak releases its offspring out into the world. We're all familiar with acorns, but this really is a masterpiece of evolution. Inside this little capsule is not only the genetic code to make one of these, it also comes packed with food and protection from the elements, meaning this seed has all it needs to survive the winter. To spread acorns, the tree relies on the help of animals like jays and squirrels, who often store them underground and then forget where they are. But the oak has an ingenious trick to improve its acorns' chances. It varies the number of acorns it produces from year to year. Some years there are thousands. Others, like this year, there are very few. While acorns are the perfect food for our friend here, the fact that she can't rely on oaks all the time means she has to find other sources of food. But every 5 or 10 years, oaks have what is called a mast year. They produce such a deluge of acorns that all the acorn eaters just simply can't cope. They're overwhelmed, no matter how hard they try. And this means that the chances of one acorn germinating and surviving becomes dramatically increased. With help from the local wildlife, at least one of our oak's acorns dropped this autumn is likely to germinate next year. And when it does, it will be a spectacular event. Fueled by nutrients locked up within the acorn, our tree's offspring is brought to life. A shoot reaches upwards to find sunlight, while a root penetrates beneath to find water. In just a few months, this acorn has developed into an infant oak with its very own leaves. This tiny organism is now able to fend for itself. The success of the oak is largely dependent on the animals that help disperse its acorns. And there's one species that in the last 300 years has been particularly helpful. And that's us. In the 18th and early 19th century, there was a frenzy of oak planting in Britain. In just 6 years, it was reported that one military officer managed to plant 922,000 oaks. The reason for this surge was simple. Britain had the world's most powerful navy, and nearly all of her ships were made of oak. This is the HMS Victory, famous for defeating the French fleet at the Battle of Trafalgar. The ship is a product of almost 6,000 oak trees, reimagined by some of Britain's finest shipwrights. This vessel and hundreds like it were the reason for Britain's insatiable demand for oak. Climb inside and you see oak everywhere. This is the lower gun deck of the HMS Victory, and many of these sturdy oak timbers have been here since the ship first set sail in 1765. At night, hundreds of men would sleep jammed together in hammocks slung from oak beams. And at mealtimes, they would eat together at these oak tables. For the crew of the HMS Victory, oak surrounded them, it encased them, and it kept them alive against the elements. The oak timbers of the Victory withstood the terrifying power of the sea. They managed to cross the Atlantic Ocean in hurricane season. They survived furious battles and innumerable volleys of cannon fire. They saw death and destruction on a colossal scale. And it was an oak hull that cradled Lord Nelson as he bled to death. Each of these spectacular oak planks has borne witness to and survived the many violent and dangerous battles on board HMS Victory. But this wood actually predates the building of the ship by hundreds of years. This wood is a product of medieval acorns that dropped all over Britain. And if you look closely, you can still see the story of their lives etched into the grain. The way oaks live, the battles they face in the natural world, and their incredible adaptations are what makes this species so uniquely useful for building ships. The curved boughs of the oak evolved to support the vast canopies of leaves, allow ships to be curved yet maintain the strength to withstand the full force of the ocean. By planting and cultivating oaks, humans have been able to travel between continents and spread our species to almost every corner of the planet. Harnessing the strength of this unique organism, we have been able to overcome even the most treacherous of oceans. Back at our tree, it's now late October, and autumn is well underway. Our oak is now getting 6 hours less sunlight per day than it was in peak summer. And as the sun is the tree's only energy source, it must stock up and store resources for the winter. Crucial to how it does this is the tree's root system, a hidden subterranean world every bit as complex as the world above. I'm extremely keen to investigate how this works, but that's no easy task. Digging up our tree to see its roots would kill it. So to investigate, we're going to excavate the root system of an oak sapling in its entirety. This is East Malling Research in Kent. For over 100 years, they have been experimenting with roots and plants to help develop better yields. And they have given us a unique opportunity to get an insight into what's going on beneath the ground. The process begins by digging a 1.5 meter deep trench. It's only then the real hard work can begin. An oak's root system, even a very young one like this, is incredibly complex and fragile, and that means it can only be excavated by hand. We are trying to ensure that no root, no matter how small, is damaged. And that means the team must be meticulous in their work. It's a painstaking process that will take 10 people almost 2 weeks to complete. But once it's done, we can begin to understand the subterranean world of the oak. Well, this is absolutely incredible. Look at how much soil they've had to remove to expose the root system of this tree. It's only 15 years old, and several tons of earth have had to be shifted. This is something you'll never see in a month of Sundays, and it's something I haven't seen ever before. But just look at the size of this. Look how far they go out. And as you go further and further out, these rootlets get finer and finer and finer until you're almost, well, you're further out than the tree is tall, virtually. With the roots exposed, we can get a glimpse into their hidden world. Under extreme magnification, we can see these strange threads. They are known as mycorrhizal fungi. They grow all over the oak's roots and help them extract phosphates, a vital nutrient, locked inside rocks in the soil. Now, I've just pulled out this little piece of rock here, and I think I can see
so that's
fungal threads that were actually attached onto this rock.
Yeah, so there's plant inaccessible phosphate in that rock. And what the mycorrhiza do is they go inside of the rock and they pull out the phosphate, and they can transport that then into the plant and into the root system, whereas the plant wouldn't be able to do that on its own.
So the oak tree simply isn't able to access the phosphate in this without the fungi?
No, hyphae is much smaller and it can penetrate inside of the rock and take the nutrients back into the plant.
The tips of the fungi can apply pressure equivalent to the inside of a car tire. And this means they can physically penetrate parts of the rock to extract nutrients. These are the hidden helpers that allow oaks to get food from the most inaccessible of places. So essentially what we've got here is an oak tree like any other oak tree, which is totally dependent on a vast army of microscopic fungal filaments, without which it wouldn't survive, and it's a sort of win-win for each of them. They're helping each other.
They both require each other to survive. If you stretched out the root system of a mature plant, you would expect it to have about 5 miles and miles of their root system. However, if you then stretched out the mycorrhiza network, that actually would spread around the entire world.
For a single tree?
For a single tree.
The more I see this system, what I thought of as a complex system is actually probably 100 times more complex. To see this root system in its full glory, we are going to take our sapling out of the ground and put it on display in one of the outbuildings at East Malling. This is what an oak tree in autumn really looks like. At the top, we see leaves are being drained of their nutrients. Below, a vast branching lattice of roots evolved to keep the tree standing and extract water and minerals from the soil. It is here that our oak will store much of its food over the winter months. But laid out like this, the roots are not just beautiful, they also tell us a fascinating story. Now, Peter, to the untrained eye, this just looks like a tangle of roots, but you can tell a story about the tree now.
I think we can, because what we can see is a root, as you can see, going down here before it heads off out in that direction there. And this is almost certainly the root that was inside the acorn. And it's headed on down in this direction, it's grown on down. And then in the place that this was growing, we've got some rock underneath, some sandstone, and this root has hit that rock, and you can see it's branched, it's sent out many branches to try and find a way around the obstacle, and it's sent this one off in that direction.
Beneath our oak at Whiteham, the roots, like this sapling, will be a kind of map showing the structure and composition of the earth in which they live.
Within the forest, there's a very heterogeneous distribution of nutrients. It's not uniform. And this particular tree has responded to that by producing this plethora of roots, this network of roots in this area to fully exploit that resource.
And presumably once that particular patch of resource here has been used up, it'll just go away.
Yes, these roots are ephemeral, they'll die off very quickly, and the plant will invest its resources elsewhere. So it's a highly dynamic system.
It's not just fixed and immobile.
No, absolutely not. What we're looking at here is something which is sensing its environment, responding to its environment, and utilising resources in a very dynamic way.
At 15 years old, this sapling has developed an amazing system of roots. Our tree at Wyton will have roots many times thicker, spreading out anywhere up to 30 metres from the trunk. It may seem excessive, but our tree will need them, not just for nutrients, but to keep itself standing. As its last leaves are finally shed, our oak is now fully prepared for the difficult conditions to come. As winter begins, our oak now enters its most perilous season. To survive, it has stripped itself of leaves, revealing an otherworldly beauty. Our tree needs to stay alive using almost no energy. But in this dormant state, our oak will have to face everything from gale force winds to sub-zero temperatures. Well, it's now the depths of winter. Our tree is bare and it's facing some of the harshest conditions it will have to endure all year. At night, the temperature is going to drop well below freezing, and out of the shelter of the forest, the winds are going to be hitting the top of this tree at full force. To get some idea of what the tree experiences, I'm going to be sleeping, or trying to sleep, 40 feet up there. While our tree looks lifeless in winter, oaks provide a home to species ranging from spiders and woodlice to bats and owls. They all utilize the great size and stability of the oak to provide shelter. A tree is not just a tree, it's a home.
I think it'd be warm enough going up there. So.
I've always wanted to experience what it might be like to live in an oak tree, and now I'm finally getting the chance, even if it is just for one night. Getting up to my perch is no mean feat, but it gives me a totally new perspective. Yeah, feels good. Once I'm safely ensconced, it's time to try and get some sleep. Have a look at it. At this height, you get a sense of how big a space this really is. For a hibernating bat or nesting owl, our oak would provide everything they need to stay safe over the winter. But for me, sleep is not coming easily. I did hear a couple of noises earlier, which I thought might have been deer or... I'm sure I heard a fox. Well, it's about 3 o'clock in the morning and it's pretty cool. It's just under 3 degrees and I'm toasty in my sleeping bag here. I've got these layers of down. And that really insulates me pretty effectively from the cold. And that is working pretty much like the bark of the oak tree, which is an effective insulator. The same principle that is keeping me warm is also keeping our oak and its inhabitants warm. Its thick bark is acting like a blanket. But temperatures in winter can drop below -10, and in those conditions, the bark is not enough. Because water expands as it freezes, if our oak were actually to freeze solid in winter, it could cause catastrophic damage. So the oak has an additional strategy. In the lead up to winter, it withdraws some of the fluid from its delicate living cells. It dehydrates itself. What liquid is left contains high concentrations of sugars that act as a kind of antifreeze. It's what allows our oak to survive not just one cold night, but many tens of thousands of them. Well, I came up at night last night in the dark, and it's now apparent just quite how high I am off the ground. Thankfully for me, it was a pretty still night. It's cold, but it's not windy. And the view you get from here is certainly worth it, but it does give me an absolutely unique experience of life in an oak tree. From up here, you really begin to appreciate the scale of our tree. It is a huge habitat. In winter, while our tree might look lifeless, it is actually a vital part of the ecosystem at Wyton. Our oak is crucial to the survival of countless thousands of insects and other animals over the inhospitable winter months. It's now mid-January, and we're going to take a new and very different digital scan of our tree. By imaging the tree without its leaves in these still conditions, we should be able to get a much more accurate estimate of the weight of our oak's wood. And this will be essential to understanding how the tree changes over the year. Dr. Eric Casella from the Forestry Commission is braving the cold for us, and the model he is creating will allow us to see our tree in a totally new way. Eric's scan reveals the sheer complexity of our oak. Using this model, we can work out that our tree is made up of almost 10 tons of wood. But the scan also reveals more. Its branches are distinctly clustered to one side of the tree. Our oak has directed the growth of its branches away from the side shaded by the forest and towards the area that receives most sunlight. It's uniquely optimized its shape to suit its position. But this phenomenon is not just above ground. An oak's root system adapts to help them stay standing in winter. To see how this works, I want to try something that has never been done before. I want to simulate the effects of gale force winds on an oak. This is a Forestry Commission research site just outside Edinburgh, and here they're doing pioneering work examining the strength and stability of many different tree species. They have allowed me in for the afternoon to come and watch one of their experiments. Today, for the first time, they're going to study how an oak tree behaves during a storm. Some people might be a little bit shocked that you're just about to pull down a perfectly healthy oak tree. What's the reason for doing it?
Well, one of the reasons that we do this is to assess the stability of trees and forests. And without doing this, we don't know what happens when a storm hits.
You're trying to simulate the sorts of forces that tree would experience in a high wind.
Exactly.
Before we pull it, the tree must be rigged with sensors to monitor exactly how it behaves under stress. Once everything is set, it's time to get back to a safe distance and begin the pull.
Beautiful.
With the tree down, Paul and his team can now analyse the results. At what angle did the tree suddenly become sufficiently, tilted over that it fell on its own?
And in this case, it was only 6 degrees.
That's nothing. That's like that.
That's correct, yeah. Yeah.
So that tree actually, it's got very shallow roots. It's not very big, is it?
No, that's exactly what it is. You can see when we looked at the roots that it was very shallow.
While at first glance it may seem this oak came down quite easily, it would have taken a force 10 storm to produce the same effect as Paul's winch. That size of storm can produce 12-metre waves at sea and has gusts of wind anywhere up to 90 miles an hour. This oak was in fact amazingly stable given its relatively shallow roots. It's likely our oak has grown much deeper roots, and with its huge spread of branches, it is able to dissipate the force of the winds much more effectively. It means that our tree can withstand much harsher conditions. That a large, heavy structure like our oak can remain standing over 400 winters is a remarkable feat of evolutionary engineering. And much of what has made it so successful at surviving the cold and the storms of winter has also made it useful to us. For thousands of years, oak has been an essential building material. By slicing and shaping trunks of oak into regular lengths, we are able to build all manner of shelters to protect us from the elements. In the harsh winter months, oak-timbered houses have kept us safe for centuries. And thanks to the durability of the wood, many of these incredibly old buildings still endure today. But there is perhaps one building above any other that showcases the extraordinary properties of oak timbers and just what they can help us create. Built in the 13th century, it remains one of the most imposing and impressive structures in the British Isles. And at its heart is oak. This is Salisbury Cathedral. It's one of the masterpieces of British medieval architecture. Looking at its size and scale, it's hard to believe this building was created almost 800 years ago. And throughout its incredible structure, everywhere you look, oak has been put to use. During its construction, an incredible 2,641 tons of oak were employed to help build the cathedral. But it's not until you ascend above the vaulted plaster ceilings that you can really understand how important this single species of tree has been. This building has within it whole forests reimagined and remoulded by human hands. Now, these oak beams have been here for a very long time. In fact, these are among the oldest of the oak beams here.
Yeah, the area we're in now is 13th century timber. It's been tested and it was felled in spring of 1222.
The roof here can be dated so precisely thanks to patterns in the wood. As an oak grows, it makes large amounts of new tissue in the spring, followed by a much smaller amount of denser wood later in the year. This rapid then slow growth gives the appearance of rings. If the summer weather is good, a tree will grow a much wider ring, and that gives us a tantalizing snapshot of the past and its climate. By looking at similar patterns across many different samples, it's possible to date pieces of oak with extreme precision. It's even possible to tell where an individual oak tree was growing. And it turns out, to build this amazing roof, the local craftsmen used oak from as far afield as Ireland. These two don't look quite the same to me.
No, if you look at the rings closely, this is Irish oak. The tree rings are really tight together because the summer and the winter almost blend into one another. English oak, they have hotter summers, so they have a better growth rate during the summer. It makes it stronger, and it's also slightly lighter as well.
Which, when you're putting thousands of tons of oak into a roof structure, you know,
it all adds up. It all adds up, yeah.
With Salisbury's spectacular roof completed, its builders decided to add one extraordinary feature. A monumental spire that must have filled the medieval population in the surrounding area with absolute awe. Today, it still remains the largest spire in the UK. And inside is an incredible lattice of oak timbers.
Tell you, if you didn't like heights, this would be not much fun for somebody. This is quite an amazing feat of engineering, really. And it was essentially an afterthought after the cathedral was built. And they've had to do this ingenious framework to help them build it.
Yeah, 1,000 people were working on it. They were doing it to get closer to God, if you like, so it was their vocation, their way of life, to be closer to heaven. But you just look up and marvel, and you almost think, it's divine intervention, isn't it, really?
It is probably one of the most amazing structures I've ever seen.
Well, you do get an amazing sense of the countryside from up here. But don't forget, it's the oak forests growing down there, the fact that they can withstand all that the weather has to throw at them, even in the harshest of winter, and the strength and durability and resilience of the wood that they gave, that made structures like this possible at all. Oak is an incredible building material, but even today we have yet to come anywhere close to creating structures with the economy and beauty of the oak tree in its natural form. As the winter deepens and temperatures drop down below freezing, our oak structure will really be put to the test. I want to find out exactly how healthy our oak is and how many more winters like this it might be able to endure. Thanks to some ingenious new technology, we now have the power to look inside it and find out.
This is very similar to the MRI scanner that we use on the body, so it takes slices through the body, we take slices through the tree, and we're just trying to determine whether the wood is sound or not.
As electrical currents are passed through the tree, a map is created that will reveal the internal structure of our oak. Well, there's the image. What does that show us?
Well, what it's showing us is we've got wet and dry areas, basically, George. The dry areas are in red, some of them around the outside of the stem. The bulk of the stem in the middle is blue, but there are breaks in that, and that suggests to us that there's something wrong with the inside of the stem. It's not a natural picture. Clearly something has happened, and we need to investigate that further.
This tiny gap between the roots of our oak may look unremarkable, but inside is a hidden world.
Let's get this into position so you can see.
Oh, yeah, that is quite a big hole, isn't it?
Ooh, and we can see all that decayed wood. So we've got a very, very large cavity where the heartwood is missing, and we can see fingers of wood hanging down where the fungus has rotted out the wood between it. We call it the Eiffel Tower fungus. Really only affects the lower part of the stem and leaves the tree effectively standing on its buttresses like this buttress here, a bit like the Eiffel Tower and its 4 legs.
Hence the name.
We've got multiple legs, hence the name.
Now, I mean, even though that is quite a big hole, it's clearly not having a hugely harmful effect on the tree. It's still here, it's still growing.
Absolutely, it's still got these feet in the ground, if you like, and still draw up nutrients and water and give it a firm footing in the ground, even though the heart's gone, and it could still be there another 500 years.
It's likely our oak will still be standing here, alive and growing in the landscape of the 26th century. But after this vast span of time has passed, the fungus eating away at our trees inside and the age of its wood will mean it looks quite different. Scattered across the UK are a select few oaks that have survived over 1,000 years, and they give us clues about our tree's ultimate fate. This is the Bowthorpe Oak in Lincolnshire, and over the last 1,000 years, its insides have been almost entirely hollowed out by fungus. Ravaged by the bitter cold of 1,000 winters, its bark looks like the surface of an alien world. The Bowthorpe Oak is a window into our tree's distant future. But for now, our tree is thriving. It has endured everything the winter has thrown at it and is ready and waiting to once again come to life.
This oak is going to have an epic growth spurt.
This is just an enormous cathedral-like space. The multitude of flavours that whiskies possess are testament to the complexity of the oak's wood.
Look at that. Is that not just the most beautiful thing? Since we've been filming, our tree has released an incredible 234,000 litres of oxygen into the atmosphere, enough to keep me alive for a whole year.
One tree is an icon of the British countryside. It is, of course, the oak. Today we begin an extraordinary experiment. We want to understand this species as never before, and to do that, we will film this one remarkable specimen for an entire year. Armed with the latest technology, we will investigate how our oak battles to survive through 4 very different seasons. In autumn, we go underground to see how its roots stocks up on precious resources.
What we are looking at is a highly dynamic system.
In winter, we discover the sophisticated strategies our tree uses to take on everything the elements can throw at it. In spring, we find out how it senses the world and how it even has its own form of language.
It talks to itself. There's a chattering goes on across the whole canopy.
And in summer, we'll see it fight predators hell-bent on eating it alive. over the next 12 months, I want to see the world as our tree does and tell its amazing story.
Wow! In the coming year, I can't predict exactly how well it'll fare, badly or well, but I can promise you one thing: you will never look at an oak tree in this same way again.
As the temperature warms and the forest is bathed in sunlight, the countless plants and animals in Wytham Woods come to life. Once again, the forest is reborn with colour, movement and life. And for our oak, this will be the season of most dramatic growth.
After many months in a state of suspended animation, our oak is beginning to come to life. The buds are finally starting to burst, and our tree is about to undergo one of the most dramatic changes of the year. In the next few weeks, this oak is going to have an epic growth spurt.
To capture this transformation, we are setting up 2 specially designed cameras. Bolted to the spot, they will take over 100 pictures each day and allow us to compress this spectacular event into a timescale we can appreciate. Just like our tree, the cameras will be powered by the sun and will capture images continuously for the next 6 months. With everything set, the cameras are started. As winter ends and spring begins, over 700,000 individual leaves emerge across our oak. It's a truly astonishing change. This remarkable transformation needs huge amounts of water. Hidden from the naked eye, at its peak our tree will be pumping 70 kilograms of water each hour out of the ground. By looking at the oak wood just beneath the bark with a microscope, we can see how this huge quantity of water gets moved around the tree. These intricate pipes are known as the xylem vessels, and they run through a layer known as the cambium that carries water upwards from the roots to the leaves. And thanks to some ingenious technology, we can now measure exactly how much fluid is moving through them. With the help of Dr. Lucy Rowland, I'm going to set up an experiment that I hope will reveal exactly how much water our tree is taking up and how this changes over the spring. This is a sat flow monitor, and as water travels up the xylem tissue, these probes heat it up. By measuring how quickly this heat is carried away, the device can calculate how much water is flowing through the trunk of the tree. Over 24 hours of measurements, we see our tree's water consumption varies dramatically.
This is at night when we don't have sap flowing up through the tree. And this peak here, this is lunchtime-ish yesterday when we have maximum flow up through the stem of the tree. And you can see here that we've got about 10 kilograms of water per hour yesterday lunchtime going up through the tree.
And that will increase as the leaf area of the tree increases.
Yeah, so the more leaves that come out on this oak over the next few weeks, the bigger that this peak is going to be.
As we move through the next 2 weeks of spring, our tree begins to consume ever more water in the middle of the day. It reaches a peak of over 60 kilograms of water an hour as more and more leaves emerge. But leaves are not all our tree is now producing. It's now late April, and for a precious few weeks, our oak grows these strange new structures. Their role is to ensure the future of our tree and the continuing success of the oak. These fragile little objects are known as catkins, and they are oak's male flower, and it's the appearance of these every spring that signals the start of the oak's reproductive cycle. And if you look carefully inside each of these little blobs, you'll find it's completely packed with grains of pollen. But these pollen grains are only half the story. Our oak will also produce a female flower, but not until later in the spring. It means that these pollen grains will need to find a female oak flower on another tree if they want to pollinate, and that means taking to the skies. In spring, an oak tree like ours can release up to 2 billion individual particles of pollen. And inside each one of these tiny grains is the unique DNA of our tree. Blown around by the wind, they can spread for miles, but their mission is simple. Each grain is seeking a chance encounter with a female flower on one of the other 5,000 oak trees in the surrounding woods. Filling the air above the forest, billions of our oak's individual pollen grains are scattered by the spring breeze. Up close, we can see how complex this tiny vessel really is. A thick, warty shell protects the delicate genetic cargo inside, as gusts of wind carry it for miles. This is the target of our oak's pollen grains, a female oak flower. If the pollen is lucky enough to land here, it will fertilize the flower. And over the next few months, the female oak flower will combine its genetic material with the pollen to create a tiny acorn, a descendant of our oak. The yearly act of pollination is crucial for the long-term future of the oak. But at Wytham, they have been using pollen to open up a unique window into its past. This is Marley Fen. It's an area of Wytham Woods that's remained largely unchanged for thousands of years. And over that time, as plants and trees reproduce every spring, the air is filled with trillions and trillions of pollen grains that eventually end up in this peat here. As pollen settles on the surface of the fen, plants, leaves and other biological matter gradually build up on top of it. Over time, layer upon layer of pollen becomes preserved within the soil. Inside this somewhat unremarkable looking mud, an incredible story has been preserved, one that records in detail the ebb and flow of various trees and plants in the area for the last 12,000 years. But to uncover the story hidden in here, you have to dig down. And that's what Dr. Helen Walkington and her team have been doing for the last 10 years. They use a long metal tube to extract thin cylinders of peat from the fen. This 4-metre-long core can tell scientists how the landscape and vegetation at Wytham Woods has changed since the end of the last ice age. This soil, from 4 metres down, was on the surface 12,000 years ago and shows Britain then was a cold and barren place.
So we've got here clay-rich material with lots of iron and fragments of rock. So I don't know if you can see here, but there are rock fragments within it. So it tells us that there was lots of erosion in this landscape. And that's how we know that there wasn't much vegetation at the time.
Without plant roots to hold the soil in place, the landscape of Britain after the last ice age was prone to rapid changes. But as we move along the core, more and more pollen begins appearing as plants of all kinds take hold. As the climate warmed, it meant oak was able to move north, and 9,000 years ago, its pollen appeared for the first time at Wytham.
This material would represent organic matter that would have been moved into Marley Fen 9,000 years ago, and at the same time oak pollen would be blowing around in the atmosphere and would settle out on the surface, and gradually all the material in the rest of the core would be on top and pushed down.
I find it incredible that I can actually put my finger on that piece of core and touch the exact part of the history of Wytham where oaks came in.
9,000 years ago.
9,000 years ago. I can actually physically connect with that.
Yeah.
And what are humans doing at this time?
At this time, we don't have humans at this point.
This is it. This is pristine.
Once the humans do come into the landscape, things start changing very quickly.
Moving through the core to nearly 2,000 years ago, cereal grains begin to appear at Wytham, and this signals a new type of human activity.
Cereal grains are brought in by the Romans, and they need to completely clear the landscape to make space for fields to cultivate them. The cereals, we don't know the exact type of cereal that they were growing because the shape of the pollen grains doesn't unlock that for us like it does for the trees, which we can get down to the species level. But certainly, yeah, the Romans would be using this landscape to grow food. And then as we progress up the core, we find that oak becomes less dominant.
But it's still here.
At this height. It's still present, but it becomes less dominant. And that's because humans have set about clearing these landscapes on a much, much greater scale.
The oak tree that we're filming in Wytham Woods is going to be growing somewhere about here?
Yeah, it was probably an acorn around 0.7 metres, something like that. And so over that represents the period of time that your oak tree's been growing.
But at least it shows that things change over time, and there have been huge changes in 12,000 years, which is a very short piece of Earth's history.
Absolutely. And in 12,000 years, those changes have been natural and human-induced, and there's a kind of interplay of those at this site. And I'm sure that in the next 1,000 years, that'll be the case as well.
The oak's pollen offers us a vivid glimpse into challenges trees face over vast spans of time. But right now, our tree is gearing up to face a much more imminent danger. It's now late May, and our tree is in full leaf. The oak boughs visibly droop with the weight of the new material they have to support. But this abundance of young, soft leaves are extremely vulnerable. A great threat is now emerging, and our tree must react quickly if it wants to survive.
This is the larva of the winter moth. It may not look very much, but this is one of the oak's most fearsome enemies. This little chap will eat an incredible amount of food to become adult. In fact, it will eat up to 27,000 times its own weight in young oak leaves. And right now, there are countless thousands of these caterpillars infesting our tree. But our oak isn't powerless in the face of this attack.
After the oak's new leaves first emerge, for a short while, the winter moth caterpillars, amongst others, will gorge themselves. Unprotected from these attackers, our oak would struggle to survive the summer. But incredibly, our tree is actually able to recognize exactly what's happening to it and respond. Professor Sue Hartley has spent much of her career looking at the ways plants defend themselves against insect attacks, and was one of the first to recognize just how sophisticated trees like our oak really are.
How does an oak tree know it's being attacked?
Well, that's really interesting. This is a winter moth, and it's about to tuck in, and you can see that when they eat the leaf, they chew the edge, and they're really messy eaters. Saliva's going all over the leaf. There's lots of goo on the leaf surface, and within that saliva there are chemicals that the oak tree can recognise.
While we might see or hear approaching danger, the oak senses it chemically. It's hard to appreciate as we have no analogous sense, but it's an incredibly fine-tuned and refined system.
This chemical signalling is really sophisticated, so our oak tree can tell whether it's a caterpillar or whether it's a different kind of herbivore, like a sapsucker, an aphid that feeds in a different way. And it's even better than that. The oak tree can tell the difference between big caterpillars and small caterpillars. The age of the caterpillar can be detected.
That is amazing.
Once our tree has sensed it's being attacked in one place, it's actually able to signal to itself to warn other parts of the attack.
It produces something called wound hormones, and those hormones move all around the plant in the sap system, and that tells the plant to turn on its defences in other parts of the tree. And they also cause airborne signals to be released that also travel all around the tree. So the defences are ready all over the place.
So if one branch, if that little branch there was suddenly attacked by lots of caterpillars, the tree would know and it would protect all the rest of itself.
It would start to, yes. It talks to itself, and there's a sort of chattering goes on across the whole canopy.
Once our tree knows it's being attacked, it begins to produce poisons that will stop its attackers in their tracks.
The main defences in oak are chemicals called phenolics and tannins.
Now that's what you have in your teacup. I mean, that's what gives tea its taste.
Tea contains a lot of tannin, and it's tannin that produces that bitter flavour in tea, because the tannin binds with protein in your mouth, your saliva, and gives it that sort of bitter taste. And that's exactly what happens when the insects try and feed. They find that the chemicals in the oak leaves will bind to the proteins in their digestive system and stop them growing so well.
So it may look like the tree is just a big green heap of food, but eating it's not that easy.
It's a real challenge to eat plants. They're full of defences and they're very clever, and they're able to detect the things that attack them. They've had millions of years to evolve to do that, and they've got a very sophisticated armoury.
After keeping the insect hordes of early spring at bay, our tree can continue its rapid growth. But now a new danger is emerging, an outlandish group of insects that have hijacked our oak's growth for their own ends. They are without doubt the strangest and most sophisticated foe our oak will face. This is a gall wasp. By laying its egg in a female oak flower, it causes a profound change in the way our tree grows. It induces a kind of tumour known as a gall to grow in place of an acorn. Inside the gall, a grub develops, feeding on the nutritious tissues within while being given shelter from enemies. This bizarre structure is the perfect nursery. This particular structure is known as a knopper gall, and it is the product of just a single species of wasp. These wasps always produce this type of gall. But there are many other species of gall wasp, and they can induce very different shaped growths.
The remarkable thing about galls is their sheer diversity. There are several hundred species of gall wasp, and each one makes a gall of a specific shape and size. But galls are not just random overgrowth of the oak. The gall wasps are actually using chemical signals in very subtle ways to hijack the developmental machinery of the oak at an early stage.
The exact way each species of wasp manages to produce such individual and unique galls is still somewhat of a mystery. but it seems they may actually be altering the oak's DNA, genetically engineering it to grow a home for their young. The myriad of different types of structures these wasps create for their offspring is simply staggering. But of all the weird and wonderful types of oak gall, there's one that has a strange connection with the human race. One type of oak gall has shaped our history. That's because for 1,000 years it was the source of a special kind of ink with which nearly all our historical documents were written. Crushed, mixed with water, iron sulfate and gum arabic, the humble home of the Androcus cholerae wasp is transformed into a cheap and extremely long-lasting ink. This is the National Archives at Kew. In the vaults of this building are housed over 1,000 years of British history in the form of millions upon millions of documents. Stored in these unassuming boxes is our past, and a huge amount of it is recorded in gall ink.
So almost any document of any importance had to be written or was written using ink made from oak galls.
That's right. It's the most important ink that we have in Western history.
What made it so good as an ink?
It's an indelible ink, so it's very hard to remove. You can see in some of these documents here, these are from the trial of Guy Fawkes.
No.
Yes, we're very lucky
the
to have
actual
them.
records?
Yep, these are the actual records of Guy Fawkes' trial. And here you can see a nice example of how indelible the ink is. So here the scribe has made a mistake, and to correct his error, he's actually had to scrape the surface of the parchment off, remove the ink from the surface, and then rewrite over it. And you can see this dark patch here and the difference in the colour, because this part of the ink was put on much later. This is a really good illustration. These kinds of legal documents had to be kept in ink that was going to last, had to be written in ink that was going to be lasting. So they're written on material parchment that's more durable, and they're written with an ink that is not going to just vanish before your eyes.
But oak gall ink wasn't just used for official documents. Everyone from poets, musicians and mathematicians to fine artists used this ink to record their thoughts, feelings and ideas.
The whole of Western civilization from about the end of the Roman period to the 19th century, our most important texts are in iron gall ink.
It seems just a bizarre twist of fate that all of this, and there are how many thousands of documents here which are written in this ink, began because a tiny wasp laid an egg in an oak bud that grew into a gall, and that provided the basis for essentially our recorded history.
That's right. What is surrounding us is just a small fragment of all the documents that survive from those 1,400 years of history.
From wasp to gall to human hands, this little quirk of evolution has shaped human history. This incredible ink brought us the Magna Carta and the American Declaration of Independence. It has brought us the music of Mozart and Bach, and the drawings of Rembrandt and Leonardo da Vinci. Thanks to gall ink, we have Isaac Newton's theories and the letters of Charles Darwin. Unwittingly, the oak tree has enabled us to record our past, to express our most profound ideas, and to share our deepest emotions. In just 3 months, our tree has gone through a radical transformation. It has brought out its leaves, it has spread its pollen for miles around, and it has repaired the damage sustained over winter. Now, as the insect populations grow ever larger, this mighty organism is finally ready to face its most challenging season. It's now June, and under the intense sunlight, trees and plants are working at full capacity. For the countless life forms of the forest, it's a time of plenty. And at the centre of this frenetic activity is our oak. Right now, it's literally being eaten alive. There are hundreds of insects that depend on the oak for sustenance, but I want to see the insects us humans don't normally come across. The ones that live high up in the oak's canopy. Well, it's now the height of summer, and the tree is in full leaf. There's even some acorns beginning to swell. This is just an enormous cathedral-like space. What's very frustrating when you're on the ground is that you know there are lots of fantastic insects and animals, but you can't reach them. So the only way to get to them is to climb. I can just find a nice place to stand. Wow. There we are. Wow. This is a very privileged view of an oak tree, and one that only an insect would have. There are some insects up here that you'll never see from the ground. I can just shake the foliage, try and get some insects in the bag. I'll bet there's lots of good stuff in here. Now, the next bit of kit is the pooter that allows me to suck insects out of the net without handling them, because lots of these things are very small. So let's see what we've got. High up in our tree, there is a wealth of life. This is where the good stuff will be. But to get a sense of its diversity and the unique adaptations of creatures up here, we have to take a closer look. And we can do that under the microscope. Now, I've got quite a few insects in here. I think we'll just empty them in there and just hope for the best.
Great.
I'll just whack them in.
Sure, it will be fun.
Big earwig there, look at that. What is absolutely amazing with this machine is the quality of that image is just breathtaking. Well, that is the head end of a cricket, and she's having a preen here. The very interesting thing about these insects is that they have their ears on the front leg, on the knees of the front leg. And if I just, there we go, you'll see a little opening there. And that is the opening of her hearing organs, which are here and here. And by having their ears on their front legs quite far apart, you're able to triangulate and know exactly where that sound is from. Now, let's see if we can see anything else here. There are absolutely minute things in here. Tiny little thing, a mite, absolutely minute. And there are probably millions, tens of millions of these up a tree. That animal is tinier than the claw on the hind foot of the cricket. Right. Now, there are lots of bugs that suck sap and feed on the green parts of the oak, but there are also quite a few bugs that feed on other insects. So it's a real ecosystem up here. There are carnivores, herbivores, all sorts of stuff. And that
is a very young bug that basically sucks other bugs dry. So it's got this amazingly long curved beak, very sharp-ended, that comes down, and it basically hunts very gently on the leaves, and it stalks animals a bit like a lion would, and it impales them on the end of this sharp beak, and it then injects venom, which is in the form of enzymes, which paralyze the prey and begin to digest the prey. It then sucks the insides of the insect up. So all you'll find at the end of it is a little empty husk of whatever it ate. And that's it there, right there.
This spectacular variety of insects are all at their most active in summer, and many of them are specially adapted to eat our oak's leaves. This is a plant hopper, and it's able to suck out sugary sap from individual plant cells. When these sapsuckers attack en masse, it can be devastating to the delicate leaves of our tree. There are many, many different insect species who call our tree home, but there are a select few who have a special relationship. Species that have evolved to specifically take advantage of the oak. This is one of our tree's infant acorns, finally beginning to emerge. It's a beautiful, intricate structure. But something here is not right. This strange black hole is a sign this acorn has been tampered with. The culprit is one of the most highly specialized and bizarre species on the oak. The acorn weevil.
Look at that. Is that not just the most beautiful thing? This is an animal that's evolved specifically with oak trees, and it lays its eggs in acorns. And it's got this enormously long beak that comes out of its head. At the end of that beak are a pair of tiny jaws, and it drills deep into acorns to lay its egg in the acorn. And she has these peculiar antennae, which are elbowed, hinged, and as she drills into the acorns, she can fold them back along the side of the head.
Our weevil also has highly specialized bilobed feet, with which it's able to grip onto the smooth surface of the oak's acorns.
Being able to see them this close brings you into their world.
Yeah.
You can understand the mechanics of what they have to do, how they have to live. It doesn't get any better than this, really. That is just evolution at its most wonderful.
The acorn weevil is just one of many insects up our tree. On one single branch, there's a beautiful and deadly lacewing. Other insect predators, such as a damsel bug and a comb-footed spider. And the tussock moth caterpillar, who can feast on our oak's leaves. All of these insects have found ingenious ways to use the oak for their own ends and extract food from it in some way or other. And it's not just insects. Us humans also consume oak. In fact, we can drink it. To discover more about this, I'm going to the land of my forefathers, Scotland. This is the Scotch whisky experience in Edinburgh. With 3,384 different bottles, it's the world's largest whisky collection. To be legally called a Scotch whisky, the alcohol must be stored in oak barrels for at least 3 years. Whisky is, in essence, oak-flavoured alcohol.
Does the growth of the oak tree affect what the whisky will eventually be?
Yes, it absolutely can do. Generally what happens in Quercus species is the tree lays down material in two distinct parts of the year. Springtime it lays down early wood, which is like a sponge, very porous. The rest of the year, late wood, which is hard and dense. The early wood is more porous or spongy, therefore it can give forth more flavour. So if you're really fussy about the type of barrel you want to use, you will go for so-called tight-grained oak, typically 12 to 16 growth rings per inch if we're going to get very specific about it.
By treating oak barrels in different ways, by charring them and seasoning them with other wine and spirits, it's possible to release multiple chemical compounds from the oak, leading to an incredible diversity of whiskey flavours.
So what we've got is actually a very complicated system. All these compounds which give flavour to the whiskey. How many different flavourings are there, would you think?
I would say that there's probably between 50 and 100 different compounds we can identify that have come out of the oak wood that can influence the character and flavour of the whiskey. So when you drink your mature whiskey, all these lovely buttery flavours, the soft texture in the palate, the sweetness, the vanilla, the coconut, the almond, all of these flavours are drawn directly from the good quality oak wood.
The multitude of flavours that whiskies possess are testament to the complexity of the oak's wood. From weevil to human, there are many hundreds of species that eat or consume the oak in some way. But what does our tree eat? Where does it get its energy from? The answer is, of course, the sun. And the way our tree does this is one of the greatest feats in the living world. The key to this lies within these little pea-like structures called chloroplasts. They're tiny, 10,000ths of a millimetre across. There are hundreds crammed into every leaf cell, and they give leaves their green colour. These minute objects do something quite extraordinary. They use sunlight to turn carbon dioxide gas from the air and water from the soil into sugars, a process known famously as photosynthesis. As they photosynthesize, chloroplasts perform surely the most important biological process of all. They release oxygen, without which all animals, including us, would die. I've long wanted to know how plants acquired this vital ability. Nick Lane is a specialist in the origins of life, and he has spent much of his career researching chloroplasts and how they evolved. He started by asking me to imagine the Earth when life first appeared, a time when it consisted solely of tiny, single-celled organisms like bacteria.
It's hard to comprehend what the world must have been like 3 billion years ago, before there was any oxygen at all. There wouldn't have been really any colour beyond the reds of iron and things. It would have been more like Mars than the Earth, except that there were oceans and so on. But there were no plants as such, there were no animals.
Amazingly, for over 2 billion years, nothing much changed. Then suddenly, around 600 million years ago, chloroplasts, much like the ones in our oak leaves, appeared. It was the defining moment in the history of life. With chloroplasts inside cells turning sunlight into food, the rest of the cell around it grew bigger and much more complex. Life was now unshackled. It no longer existed only as bacteria, but was free to evolve into an unimaginable variety of shapes and forms.
Once you had chloroplasts in these complex cells, somehow they did it better. They produced more oxygen. They changed. I think perhaps it was partly that they began to colonize the land. They came out of the water and they began to take over the terrestrial parts of the planet. They really changed the way that the world worked. So we had this long delay from 3 billion years ago, when photosynthesis first started, to only about 600 or 700 million years ago, when the Earth went into some kind of convulsion, and then the origin of animals shockingly recently. If you're thinking about these billions of years periods, animals exploded into the fossil record on the back of oxygen, on the back of these chloroplasts taking over the world.
So what's happening inside these tiny green peas, the chloroplasts, inside each of these leaves, where they harvest the sun's energy and produce food and oxygen as waste, it's the single most important reaction on the face of the earth.
From the point of view of complex life, that's undoubtedly the case. Without that reaction, there would be no food to eat, and there would be no oxygen to breathe. We simply would not exist.
What I love about this story is it means that when I peer at the chloroplast in the cells of our oak tree, I'm looking directly at the most important event in the history of life. At the height of summer, our oak, its magnificent structure and its hundreds of thousands of leaves, are able to bask in the sunlight and convert it into food. In the process, it pumps out the oxygen that we all rely on to stay alive. In this single act, our oak is performing a feat that we have yet to match. As August begins, it's now been a year since we made the first digital model of our tree. Thanks to the detailed measurements we've taken over the year and the weather data from Wycombe Woods, it's now possible to make estimates that reveal the ways our tree has changed. Despite its age, our tree has grown. Over the last 12 months, it has been extracting carbon dioxide from the atmosphere through its leaves, and some of this has been refined into carbon and forged into new wood. While our oak's great size and age means that new growth is extremely thinly spread, it has increased in size. In fact, our tree has created 230 kilograms of new wood. This much material has literally been plucked from thin air. To help it grow and photosynthesize, our tree has had to consume huge quantities of water. Thanks to our sap flow data, we can see that over the 71 days we recorded it, the tree drank an incredible 58,822 litres of water. But our oak tree hasn't just taken from the environment around it. As it photosynthesizes, its leaves produce oxygen. Since we've been filming, our tree has released an incredible 234,000 litres of oxygen into the atmosphere. And that much oxygen is enough to keep me alive for a whole year. By spending a year looking at this one tree, we have been able to see just how dynamic and complex this organism really is. We've seen how it can create 700,000 leaves and keep them safe. We've seen how it can withstand the harsh winter conditions. And we've seen how our tree sits at the centre of a vast, interconnected web of life. In the face of everything thrown at it, the wind, the rain, freezing temperatures, and the constant attack by insects and fungi, our tree has thrived. In the process, it's provided a home and a source of food for millions of individual organisms. It's what makes this incredible species such an important part of the British countryside. The oak's endurance and longevity have woven it into the lives of the thousands of creatures that rely on it. And that includes us. This colossus of the British Isles has permeated our culture. Oaks have shielded us, protected us from danger. They have allowed us to explore the seas. They have brought us pleasure. They have helped us express our most profound ideas. Oaks have borne witness to our deepest sorrows and our most joyful moments. This plant, perhaps more than any other, has become part of us.